Welcome to the lecture on Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 4, Part 7. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at Aristotle's famous definition of truth from the Metaphysics and seeing how in his definition Aristotle ties the definition of truth, what it is for something to be true, to reality, to the way the world actually is. We'll be looking at some of the implications for Aristotle's famous definition, as well as how this definition that Aristotle provides ties into and is related to the most popular contemporary conception of truth, which is known as the correspondence theory of truth. Even further, we'll be looking at the distinction between truth and justification. Justification is one of the primary epistemological concepts. And we'll also be looking at a couple of the theories of truth that are competitor theories to the correspondence theory of truth. We'll be seeing why contemporary philosophers have put forward these competitor theories, and also some of the central problems with these competitor theories of truth. Before we get into Aristotle's particular definition, it's important to understand Aristotle's impetus for putting forth this conception of truth. Aristotle, as you no doubt know, was the student of Plato. Plato himself was the student of Socrates. Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander the Great, and much of Aristotle's career was spent developing and systematizing philosophy in terms of syllogistic logic and trying to make sense of what past philosophers had said in terms of his own conceptions of how the world worked, how philosophy should be practiced. Now, there were past philosophers before Aristotle, who seem to have some paradoxical or perhaps even incomprehensible conceptions of truth. And so Aristotle thinks that in order to make sense of what's going on before him philosophically as well as in his own philosophy, he needs to get clear on the definition of truth and how truth, as talked about by those philosophers who came before him, is related to his conception of truth. Says Aristotle, "Some people have acquired this opinion," that's these paradoxical opinions about truth, "as other paradoxical opinions have been acquired. When men cannot refute Aristotle arguments, they give in to the argument and agree that the conclusion is true. This, then, is why some express this view. Others do so because they demand a reason for everything, and the starting point in dealing with all such people is definition. Now the definition rests on the necessity of their meaning something. For the form of words of which the word is a sign will be its definition." So, says Aristotle, let's not talk about the properties of truth yet. Let's give a definition of truth, and then we can move from there. He thinks that one of the primary problems that people before him have had in talking about truth is that they haven't first defined truth. Sure, maybe they're talking about truth, maybe they're giving some of the properties of truth or talking about the way truth appears to them, but since they haven't started out with a definition, their philosophies are slippery and they're liable to easily move without recognizing it between different competing, contradictory definitions of truth. So here is Aristotle's specific definition of truth. And as I've already noted, this is a very famous definition of truth. Almost any philosopher will be able to rattle this off to you, or if you read it to them, will be able to tell you that this is Aristotle's definition of truth. He says, "To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. So that he who says of anything that it is, or that it is not, will say either what is true or what is false, but neither what is nor what is not is said to be or not to be. So there are a few different things going on in this definition, and I'll unpack these for you. This isn't the clearest way that Aristotle could have said this. So the first thing that we need to unpack is what Aristotle thinks the relationship is between truth and falsity. Truth, as you know, is a property that propositions have. Falsehood is a property that propositions have as well, and these propositions, these properties of propositions are related to one another. So, according to Aristotle's definition, for any proposition, there are only two options. Either that proposition is true or that proposition is false. Those are the only two things that a proposition can be with respect to truth and falsity. Thus, as philosophers will say, truth and falsity are both mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. Here's what that means. Two properties that something has are mutually exclusive when to have one of the properties precludes the object having it from having the other of the properties. So let's take another example, something that's not truth and falsity. So take the example of being a cat and being a dog. Being a cat and being a dog are mutually exclusive properties. If something is a cat, it can't possibly be a dog. If something is a dog, it can't possibly be a cat. There is no such thing that is both a cat and a dog at the same time. Similarly, with respect to truth and falsity, if something's true, it can't be false. If something's false, it can't be true. Something can't be both true and false at the same time. That's what it means for two properties to be mutually exclusive. And then, with two properties being jointly exhaustive, that means that there is no third option. These two properties exhaust the logical space of options. So, with respect to truth and falsity, something's either true or it's false, not both, because of truth and falsity being mutually exclusive, but also there isn't some third option beyond truth and falsity. So, with respect to my example of cats and dogs, being a cat and being a dog are mutually exclusive, but they're not jointly exhaustive because there are other options. Something could be neither a cat nor a dog. It might be a horse, or it might be a tree. Not so with truth and falsity. A proposition is either true or it's false. So here are some immediate implications for the history of philosophy that came before Aristotle. Here's a quote. While the doctrine of Heraclitus, that all things are and are not, seems to make everything true, that of Anaxagoras, that there is an intermediate between the terms of a contradiction, seems to make everything false. For when things are mixed, the mixture is neither good nor not good, so that one cannot say anything that is true. So notice what Aristotle's doing here. He thinks that the doctrines of Heraclitus and Anaxagoras confuse things about the definition of truth. Heraclitus is claiming that truth and falsity aren't mutually exclusive, that things are both true and false. Anaxagoras, on the other hand, is claiming that truth and falsity aren't jointly exhaustive. He's saying that there are other options between truth and falsity, but, says Aristotle, once we're looking at the definition of truth aright, once we're looking at the definition of truth that I've provided, we can recognize that, according to Heraclitus, everything is true, but that's ridiculous. And according to Anaxagoras, everything is false, and that's also ridiculous. So, once we start with definitions, we can see that Heraclitus and Anaxagoras were confused about truth and falsity, which is a good reason to start with definition. Now, it's of course up to Heraclitus and Anaxagoras if they wanted to, or defenders of Heraclitus and Anaxagoras, to explain why Aristotle's definition of truth is the wrong definition, but simply referring to claims that they've made, Heraclitus and Anaxagoras, without referring to a definition, isn't going to show why Aristotle is wrong. Let's move on to some distinctions that Aristotle seems to be making. The first distinction is between propositions themselves and reality. So here's a quote from Aristotle. Again, every object of understanding or reason, the understanding either affirms or denies. This is obvious from the definition. Whenever it says what is true or false, when it connects in one way by assertion or negation, it says what is true, and when it does so in another way, what is false. So, according to Aristotle, propositions, the things that can be true or false, connect with reality. When they connect in the right sort of way, the propositions are true. When they connect in the wrong sort of way, the propositions are false. Now, propositions are semantic items that are expressed via different human activities. I'm expressing propositions right now via uttering sentences. I could also write down propositions and write down words and express propositions via those written words, or I could believe certain things and believe propositions via my beliefs. So human activity is involved in expressing propositions, surely, such that if humans went out of existence, there wouldn't be any more expression of propositions going on. However, reality is the stuff that exists out there, the world as it really is. So even if humans went out of existence, reality would still be there. So notice this central distinction between propositions and reality. Propositions are related to human activity for their expression. Reality is just the way reality is. Now, humans can interact with reality and change reality, of course, but if humans go out of existence, reality itself doesn't go out of existence, and reality isn't entirely determined by human activity. There are all sorts of properties that the world has that humans had nothing to do with creating. So, propositions point at or attempt to describe reality according to Aristotle's conception of truth. Sometimes propositions get the description right, sometimes propositions get the description wrong. So, for example, if I say on a Tuesday that it is Tuesday today, the proposition expressed by my utterance is true because it correctly describes reality. If I say on a Tuesday that it's Thursday today, the proposition that I express via my utterance is false because it doesn't get reality right. It misdescribes reality. Let's move on to another distinction, the distinction between truth and justification. Now, this is only implicit in what Aristotle is talking about. This is a more modern distinction than Aristotle, but it's important for understanding what's going on when we're talking about truth. While propositions are expressed by human activities, as we've already noted, properties are true only if they accurately describe reality. So what makes a proposition true, according to Aristotle's conception of truth, is reality itself, nothing to do with the person who expressed the proposition, what the person thinks, or what communities of people believe, or anything like that. Now, sometimes we might not know whether a particular proposition is true. Think of all the things that you don't know, but you could know. Those are all sorts of propositions right now that have truth values, because propositions have their truth values just based on whether they correctly describe reality, but you haven't yet figured out whether those propositions are true or not. Think about all the propositions that we didn't used to know about, for example, the natural sciences, but that we came to discover. Now, we didn't make those propositions true. Those propositions were already true. We discovered the truth of those propositions by learning things about the world. And there are all sorts of propositions right now that you couldn't possibly know, but maybe you will eventually. Propositions, for example, about things that are really far away, or things that we don't yet have the technology to discover. These propositions are still true or false, independent of you and what you can possibly know. You just don't know them yet, or you can't possibly know them. So this distinction about the truth of propositions and what you can know is a distinction between truth and justification. We can have justification for or against the truth of any proposition, regardless of whether the proposition is actually true or false. So justification and truth are independent of each other. You can be justified in believing false propositions, or you can be unjustified in believing true propositions. So your justification can be misleading. Think about times when you've gotten things wrong. You didn't get things wrong because you just totally weren't paying attention. You got things wrong because you had justification that was misleading. So when people say things like so and so is true, or such and such is true for me, what they mean is I have justification for that. According to Aristotle's definition of truth, things can't be true for some people and false for other people. Propositions are true only insofar as they correctly describe reality. Now, you might be justified in thinking that a proposition is true, and maybe it is true. Or you might be justified in thinking a proposition is true when that proposition is actually false. Your justification is misleading. So don't make the mistake of thinking that truth and justification are the same thing. Now, Aristotle's definition of truth plays very nicely with what's called the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth is the contemporary name for this conception of truth that we've been looking at. Here's the formal definition. A proposition is true if and only if, and that's what that IFF means, if and only if, that particular proposition represents the world accurately. So the proposition, the cat is on the mat, is true if and only if the cat is actually on the mat. Now notice that that's independent of whether I have justification for the cat's being on the mat. It's independent of what I hope about the cat and the mat. I can hope that the cat is on the mat when the cat isn't actually on the mat. So I can hope that the proposition, the cat is on the mat, is true, even if the proposition is false. So this correspondence that the correspondence theory of truth is named after is the correspondence between propositions and reality. Truth, that is fundamentally about a relationship between propositions and reality, independent of what you have justification for believing, independent of what your community believes, independent of what you care about, etc. So, it's possible for us to be in an epistemic position, a position with respect to our justification and knowledge, such that we can't tell whether a proposition is true or false. This is a feature that the correspondence theory of truth has, and it seems to be a beneficial feature. When we're talking about truth, we're talking about reality, it seems. In the same way as sometimes we don't know the way reality is actually structured, sometimes we don't know which propositions are true and which ones are false. And this is the traditional and most widely accepted theory of truth. When you talk about a theory of truth with philosophers, they'll assume you're talking about the correspondence theory of truth, unless you make some special notation that you're talking about some other theory of truth. And one of the reasons this is the traditional and most widely accepted theory of truth is because of Aristotle's particular definition. Aristotle is one of the creators of what we're now calling philosophy. This is what Aristotle called truth. Therefore, when we're talking about truth, the thought is we should use words the way they've traditionally been used. If we want to talk about something else, we should give it a different name. Now, there are competing theories of truth, and we're going to talk about two of them. The first is known as the Coherence theory of truth. The coherence theory of truth, a competitor to the correspondence theory, claims that a proposition is true if and only if that proposition stands in the requisite coherence relations with other relevant propositions. Now, requisite here is a broad term that I've left intentionally, I've left broad, because there are many different versions of the coherence theory of truth, and one of the things that separates the versions from each other is what they take the requisite coherence relations to be. Usually, though, coherence is cashed out in terms of some minimal consistency relation, and usually the other relevant propositions that are talked about in the definition are other believed propositions. So the thought is generally that if I believe propositions x, y, and z, then some other proposition, proposition A, is true if and only if A coheres with or is consistent with propositions x, y, and z. Now, one of the main reasons for the coherence theory of truth is that coherence theorists recognized that consistency is a feature of sets of true propositions. What this means is that if the proposition "the cat is on the mat" is true, then the proposition "the cat is not on the mat" can't also be true. The true propositions have to be coherent with one another. They have to be consistent with one another such that it's possible that they could all be true at the same time. Yeah, this seems like something that we want to build into our theory of truth. However, there is a central problem with the coherence theory of truth. The problem is that conflicting propositions can both be true so long as they meet the relevant coherence relations. That is, nothing outside of coherence grounds truths or connects truth to reality. So while in the correspondence theory of truth, what makes something true is its relation to reality, in the coherence theory of truth, there is no relationship with reality that grounds truth. So, for example, if I believe propositions x, y, and z, and A is coherent with propositions x, y, and z, then A is true. But if you believe propositions B, C, and D, and not A is coherent with or consistent with propositions B, C, and D, then not A is true. But this means that both A and not A are true. But this can't be the case. This would be very strange if we had two conflicting propositions, A and not A, that were both true. And in fact, this seems to fly in the face of the general reason for the coherence theory of truth to begin with, trying to make sure that coherence was a function, that truth was a function of coherence. Well, now we've got two different propositions that are not coherent, that aren't consistent with each other, that are both true. So since there's nothing that grounds truth in reality, any proposition you please, it seems, so long as minimal coherence relations are met, can be true. But that's not what we mean when we're talking about truth, just something that's coherent with other things that are believed. So most people have rejected the coherence theory of truth because it seems to allow for any proposition to be true. The other competitor that we're going to look at is known as the pragmatic theory of truth. According to the pragmatic theory of truth, a proposition is true if and only if that proposition plays a proper role in some active process of inquiry. Now, this is the theory of truth that's generally been tied to or ascribed to pragmatist philosophies of Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Sometimes people say that in order to be a pragmatist philosopher, you need to at least accept the pragmatic theory of truth. that propositions are true if and only if they play proper roles in some active process of inquiry. Now, one of the things that pragmatists noticed is that when we go out into the world and we perform human activities, we search for things to be true. So we uncover truths. Truths, they think, shouldn't be conceived of as just lying around out there independent of human activity and perhaps having no implications for human activity. Truths are the sorts of things that are intimately involved in human activity. Now, sometimes people satirize the pragmatic theory of truth and say that pragmatists claim that truth is whatever is useful. That isn't quite right. Now, that satire is based on a confusion of this term pragmatic or pragmatism as just what's useful. But the pragmatists weren't just talking about usefulness, they were talking about use and activity. What's true needs to play some fundamental, essential role in human activity. One of the reasons for pragmatism as a philosophical movement at all in the United States was that pragmatists worried that philosophy had threatened to become untethered from the practical activities of daily life. They were worried about apparently foundationless metaphysical speculations, especially in the philosophy of people like Hegel, and they thought that they could return philosophy back to the concrete activities of daily life by insisting on a conception of truth where truth was essentially tied to human activity. However, there is a central problem here. It seems that what the pragmatists are talking about when they're talking about truth is just what the rest of us are talking about when we're talking about justification. But we already have a word for justification. Justification. If we want to talk about justification, the thought is we shouldn't go around redefining truth so that truth plays the role of justification. We should just use the word justification. Now, if pragmatists don't like that a focus on truth threatens to untether philosophy from the practical activities of daily life, they should say, well, look, the thought goes, maybe philosophy shouldn't be all that concerned with truth. It should be concerned instead with justification, what we can possibly justify, what we can possibly, via justification, incorporate into our day-to-day lives. But it seems that the pragmatist philosophers are pulling a perhaps dishonest switcheroo on us here, redefining truth in terms of some other concept. But there's no need to do this. We can just use this other concept. So in this lecture, you've seen that there are a few different conceptions of what truth is, but it seems like we have a historical conception of truth from Aristotle where what truth is what reality is. Truth is a property that propositions have only insofar as reality matches what the propositions say. Now, if somebody doesn't like this definition of truth, if they think we should talk about truth in some other terms, that's fine. But the conception of truth should both avoid the problems that we saw in the coherence theory of truth and not be trying to pull an apparently dishonest rhetorical switcheroo on us by redefining truth in terms of some other concept that we already have a perfectly good word for. Now, the correspondence, coherence, and pragmatist theories of truth are not the only theories of truth out there. There are a bunch of other theories of truth that we just don't have time to go into here, but those are the three main theories of truth. And it seems to most people that Aristotle's definition has withstood the test of time, and that insofar as we're talking about truth, what we're really talking about is correspondence to reality and nothing more. Thank you.